In the last lectures, we edited our form using the template-driven approach. Now let's move on to the reactive approach for the new recipe or editing an existing one. We got our recipe edit component here, and it doesn't have a form inside of it. So we should definitely change this. In here, I will start by adding a row and then a column which should span the full width on all device sizes, and then the form without an action because we don't want to send a request. We want to handle it in Angular. Now we will need a couple of inputs here. I will actually begin with the save and cancel buttons though. So right at the start of this form, I'll have another bootstrap row, call XS12 will be the width, and here I want to have a button of type submit with a class of button and then button success so that it's a green button, which should simply save the form, should save the recipe. I'll have a second button of type button so that it doesn't submit the form, which will be which will get the class button danger, which should simply cancel the editing here. So these are the two buttons which allow me to control the form in the end. Now for the inputs. I definitely want a row with my default column width here, where I will add a div with the form group CSS class to simply use that bootstrap CSS class to give it some nice styling. Then I'll add a label for the name of that recipe, and I'll say name here, and I will add the input. The input will be of type text with the ID name maybe, and let's already structure this over multiple lines, and with a class of form control to make it look nice. Now I will actually copy that row and paste it in below this name. Here I want to have my image path. So I'll name it image URL here, this input. And here I simply want the user to paste in the image path. So that will be this row. Below it I'll add another row. Here I won't have my form group though. Instead I want to preview the image the user pasted in. So I will simply add my image element here. I will later bind the source and assign the image responsive class to it. We will fine-tune this later if needed. So that allows the user to enter a title and an image and see that image as a preview. Now I'll add another row with another label, which should now say description, so the description of our recipe or the content of the recipe. So I'll assign this for the ID description, which of course will be this, but this will not be an input. I'll change it to a text area. Therefore, I also need a closing tag for this. On this text area, I want to provide, let's say, 6 rows for typing, so that it's not too big, not too small, should be okay. Well, and then below this, I'll add yet another div. This will later be required for the ingredients of that recipe here. So here we will actually need to create an array of controls and we will need to manage this. We did learn how to do this, but here we will see it in practice in a real project. Now here, as this will be for my array of items, I will get rid of the label and get rid of the ID. Also get rid of that div here. Instead, I will add a new row inside of there. We're going to have multiple ingredients probably. And each row should then have a couple of columns. The first one spanning almost the entire width. It will hold the input for the name of the ingredient. The second one being very narrow next to it, which should hold the amount. And the third one, also a very small column, should hold a button which allows me to delete an ingredient, therefore button danger, and put an X on it. So if we have a look at this, that is how a single ingredient will look like. Now we don't have descriptions for these inputs. You could of course restructure this form and try placing labels next to them or use a different layout. I like that layout here though. With that we got the HTML code almost finished. There is something missing, but before we work on this, let's make this base form work without ingredients for a start. So in the last section, we created the HTML code for our form. Now let's initialize our form. And we will use the reactive approach, as I already said. Now for this approach, it's important to understand if we are in edit mode or new mode. And we do get this information here. Why is that important? Well, of course, because depending on this, we need to pre-populate the fields or not. So I will create a new private method in the recipe edit component, which I'll name init form, because it is responsible for initializing our form. The form itself shall be a property here, so I will name it recipe form, and it will be of type form group, as you learned, to be imported from @Angular forms. Now we can build this recipe form here in init form. Basically, I will reach out to it and assign a value, and this value will be a new form group to give us the outer shell of our form, so to say, the frame. Form group takes a JavaScript object where we have key value pairs for the controls we want to register. So the first control I do want to register here is the name of the recipe. This will be a new form control, so we should import form control from @Angular forms too. And here now, as I said, it's important to decide whether we are in edit mode or not, because that will determine whether we want to assign an initial value or not. Well, we could simply create a variable at the top here, which holds our recipe name, and let's set it to an empty string by default. Then let's add some logic which decides what the value should be if we are in edit mode. So let's check if this edit mode. If that's the case, then recipe name should probably be something else, and it should probably be the value of the recipe we can load with the ID we got here. We do have the ID stored up there. So we can simply inject our recipe service. Let's do this here. Recipe service, make sure to add the import at the top here. And now we can fetch our recipe here, the recipe we're currently editing. So I will fetch it right at the beginning, the recipe, reaching out to the recipe service, and then with get recipe and passing the ID of the recipe we know we are editing, I can get it. Actually, I shouldn't do it here because I would try to get one if we don't have an ID because we are not in edit mode. I should do it in here. So now we got a recipe. Now we can simply access the name of the recipe and assign this to our variable here. Now, the same will be true for the image URL, the recipe image path. It's an empty string by default, and the same is probably true for the description. So recipe description is also an empty string by default. And the ingredients, I'll come back to these. So for now, let's overwrite all these variables if we are in edit mode. So recipe image path will be set to recipe image path, and recipe description will be set to recipe description here. And with that, we can simply assign recipe name here for the name as a default value, because it will either be an empty string, that's the default, or if we happen to be in edit mode, it will have the name of the recipe we are editing as a value. So with that, we got the name. Now let's also assign the image path. Here I'll also add a new form control and set this to recipe image path. As a side note, we'll take care about validation later. And let's assign the description here, a new form control again, and we should assign the recipe description. Now again, I'll take care about the ingredients later. That is our base form created. Now when should we call init form, this method here? We should call it whenever our route params change, because that indicates that we reloaded the page. So that is where we should call this init form. Now with that, we are creating the form and it probably will work. However, now we need to synchronize our form to our HTML code. We'll do this in the next lecture. So we created our form, let's now synchronize it to the HTML code. For this, first of all, and that's very important, we need to add something to the app module. In the imports array, we now not only need the forms module, we'll also need the reactive forms module, which needs to be imported from @AngularForms. Otherwise, synchronizing with our HTML code will fail because we don't have access to the directives we need for that. So therefore, what I'll do is go to my recipe edit component HTML file, and now I want to connect my form. Let's start on the overall form element. Here we have the form group directive, which we should use with squared brackets because we need to pass some data to that directive via property binding, and that data is our recipe form. So let's quickly assign this. Now we're telling Angular that our overall form is managed by us and that Angular itself should not manage it. Instead, it should take our form. With this, we can now assign our own controls. So let's simply go to a first input, the name here, and there we have the form control name directive. Now we could enclose it in squared brackets and then use single quotation marks between the double quotation marks, or we omit both and simply use this syntax. And now the name here, of course, has to match the name we set up here. So here we chose name, we should choose the same in the HTML code. Now we'll copy this also for the image URL. Here I chose image path as a name, so let's make sure to use this. And of course, description for our text area here. Here I also will add the form group name directive and assign description. Now to be able to see something, I'll also set up the ng submit listener and listen to on submit. Now here of course I don't need to pass the form as an argument. Instead I can simply add the on submit method here and for now simply log my recipe form to the console. Let's see if everything works as it should. So once this has recompiled, I'll head over to the form and this looks okay. It almost works as expected. The name was pre-populated for the selected recipe and it does update if we change this to Big Fat Burger. The description is not displayed though. So that is not how I want this to behave. As a side note, on new recipe, it correctly sets this to an empty form. So that is okay, but would be nice if the description is displayed too. If I submit the form, let's have a look at the value. Description, actually it says what else you need to say. So what could be wrong about the description then? Well, if we have a look at the text area, I simply assigned the wrong directive. It should be form control name. With this in place, if it reloads, this looks much better. So with that, the synchronization is working. The next step is to get our ingredients to work correctly. And that actually will involve a couple of steps because we need to manage this array of ingredients for that.